I'm here representing Walsall Afro-Caribbean Community Association. It's a busy day today at Walsall ACCA because one of their main activities is hosting dominoes tournaments, and they have a large number of visitors from London and the southeast of England today, so no one was available, but I've come along because I have helped them on a couple of occasions over the years to develop heritage type projects. They do have a strong heritage of their own because the organisation was set up in 1979, and we think it's one of the oldest established black-led charities in the Birmingham area, in the West Midlands area, and possibly in the country as a whole. They operate from quite large premises just on the outskirts of Walsall. Back in 2005, some of you may remember that the Heritage Lottery Fund, and in fact the big lottery fund at the time, offered grants to organisations that wanted to commemorate the Second World War, was it the 60th anniversary of the end of the Second World War back in 2005 rather. And in 2005, Walsall ACCA did a project that looked at the contribution of Afro-Caribbean people during the Second World War. So when the HLF published the call for applications for First World War projects, we revisited the theme, and but what actually happened, what I'd like to tell you about, I'm sorry I don't have any slides, but what's developed is a very much a local-based history, a local-based heritage. How the Great War impacted on the Walsall, Telford, West Midlands area. And through what we found out, some research and so on, it became quite interesting how the Great War, how the contribution of black people had affected quite a small area of the country. And one of the interesting factors was that there'd been a considerable number, quite a large black Afro-Caribbean community, whichever phrase you want to use, living in Walsall and the Black Country, and also in Telford, from around the time of the Great War, much longer than before the Empire Windrush era of large-scale immigration in the 1950s. And what we found out was that during the Great War, there were several large steelworks operating in the Walsall area. One of them was called Stewart and Lloyd Steelworks. It's all been demolished now, unfortunately. It's all housing, but it was actually there until the late 1970s. But during the Great War, there was fear of the Zeppelin attacks. And of course, with the foundries in those days, the foundries glowed in the dark. And once you'd got the foundry in full production, all hot, ready to melt the metal and so on, you couldn't just switch it off. It had to keep in continuous production, so you'd keep the necessary heat that you needed for the manufacturing process. So in the event of a Zeppelin attack, the steelworks were glowing in the dark, so they acted as a perfect target spot for the Zeppelins. Well, in these circumstances, white European people living in the Walsall area wouldn't work in the steelworks at night. They said, we're not going in, we won't do it. And the same was also happening in Telford to some extent, in the area now called Wellington, although that was never subject to a Zeppelin attack. But in the Walsall area, the Zeppelins were coming fairly regularly in the middle part of the war, looking for the steelworks. And of course, if you dropped a bomb or explosives on the steelworks, you'd have a tremendous chain reaction explosion. So the owners of the steelworks, the Stewart and the Lloyds family, and also the Keane family, which some of you may know from Guest Keane and Nettlefolds, which is still a company, a large manufacturing company, involved mainly in making parts for aeroplanes these days. But at that time were a steel company as well. They thought, well, where are we going to get labour to work in our steelworks? Any suggestions? What did they do? Yes, you've probably guessed it. They had connections, or some of their families had connections, especially in Trinidad, Tobago, Demerara, and to some extent Jamaica as well. And so there was a recruitment drive, not like for the military, not for anything as glamorous as the West Indian Regiment, but a recruitment drive for people to come from the Caribbean, to give up the agricultural work they were probably doing at the time, and to become steel workers in Britain. And from what we can gather from looking at some records of birth, deaths and marriages, and also some nationalisation, granting of British citizenship documents that were found, we think that around 380 men came from the Caribbean in 1916 and 1917 to work in the steelworks of the Black Country. Most of them at the Stewart and Lloyd's factory, steelworks in what's now Bilston, and another not far away called Willenhall. After the war, it appears, well, it must have been the case, that they were able to send for their families, their wives, because by around 1923, the school records for Walsall show that there were about 115 black children, Afro-Caribbean children, already living in the Walsall area. Now that's quite a significant number compared to any other part of the country, and also in Wellington, in Shropshire, where a community had established, and there is a community organisation based in Wellington in Shropshire, which is Afro-Caribbean led, that traces its history all the way back to 1926 continuously, which I think is also a very interesting development. During the Second World War, I'm sorry, I know we're here to talk about the First World War, but during the Second World War, the Stewart and Lloyd's families returned to the same source of labour, but that time with the full support of the British government. In order to meet all the requirements of the HLF when you put together one of their First World War projects, we didn't really want to stick to just one small theme, which was sort of manufacturing industry. We also had to balance it and to make it more interesting for the participants and the volunteers who were doing the research and making the presentation boards and things. We also had a look at the Halifax incident. I don't know how many of you are aware of the Halifax incident. I see one person nodding. The Halifax incident was a dreadful thing where some of the families of those who'd come to live in the West Midlands were caught up in a troop ship on its way from Europe, from the Caribbean to Europe, carrying volunteers for the British West Indian Regiment, was diverted because of German submarine activity in the North Atlantic. So instead of sailing directly from the Caribbean to England as was planned, it was diverted up the east coast of the North American continent towards Canada. But unfortunately it was winter time, and no one had given the volunteer soldiers any coats to wear. So they only had light shirts and light trousers, and they found themselves off the coast of Newfoundland in November 1916 with no winter clothing, and more died of exposure on the ship than actually made it. And of course that was a really sad thing, so it was classified as an official secret for nearly 50 years. And the documents that were released by the Public Records Office that talk about this incident, and they were only released around 1996, are really very, very interesting. And you read we touched earlier on about the way the Germans segregated people. If you read those documents, you'll see that the volunteers were sort of very much considered second-class citizens, very, very much so. Just finally, immediately, previous speaker spoke about Afro-Caribbean soldiers as being labourers. In 1918 and 1919, around 80 soldiers who'd come from South Africa in, I think it was called the South African Labour Regiment, who were due to return to South Africa, were actually given jobs in the steelworks of the West Midlands. They did very heavy work which required tipping the cast steel out of the moulds whilst it was still quite hot. And the people who did that work, they were rewarded with as much free beer as they wanted, believe it or not. And because it was such hot work, it didn't make them drunk. You know, the alcohol burnt away. So not as interesting a story perhaps as some of what you've heard today, and one that's very much confined to a specific local area and a specific organisation, but I think one that does show how the Great War touched individual areas of the country and led to the creation of communities which are there to this day. So many parts of Britain can say we have an Afro community that dates back to the Empire Windrush era. Walsall and Telford have one that dates back to the Great War era because of the need for labour at that time. So thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen.